Well, I'm going to just share a little bit about how I got into this. So my objective today is not to, I don't know that I can teach you anything after the last 3 days of listening and learning. They say never be the smartest guy in the room. No danger here of that happening. I have a very strong perspective on the tap water state in the United States, the problem with the proliferation of single-use plastics, and how we solve that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our company that's working to do our part to completely change the way the world drinks water. And this is just one part of an entire ecosystem of the great group that Amy has put together. Thrilled to be here. It's such a privilege to be here. So thank you for just the opportunity to share a little bit about what we're doing. Very quickly, I got involved in this because of my daughters. That was the real impetus. So I lived in San Francisco for about a decade, outside of San Francisco in Silicon Valley. It's a longer story that I'm gonna have to keep really short, but the short of it is I was going to their soccer games, and if you grew up in Ohio like I did, you think everyone in SF just eats wheatgrass and wears Birkenstocks and recycles 100% of the time, and it just doesn't exist that way, right? And so I was taking my kids to soccer games, and they're drinking out of single-use plastic water bottles, which somebody brought for them, and then they're drinking energy drinks and sugary, caffeinated, carbonated crap that's dispensed by companies like Coke and Pepsi that are effectively kind of poisoning our kids and our societies. And I became really, really passionate about water. And I'm gonna give you a real top level story and narrative around what the problem is in the United States, how we see it, and how we're gonna solve that. Number one, Flint. So a lot of people think of Flint as just like a point in time or a place in time. The reality is that I am living in Flint, you are living in Flint, we are living in Flint. And I'll give you some data that supports that. Between the periods of 2020 and 2021, there was a 12-month analysis performed. 186 million Americans are drinking lead-contaminated tap water. 186 million. That's over half of the United States. Now, within that subset, there were 7 million Americans that were drinking over 15 parts per billion leaded tap water. That's defined by the EPA as critical system failure, catastrophic. And then 3,000 communities, separate study, 3,000 communities in the United States since Flint have actually had tap water that's above, on average, 2 times higher than what was present in Flint, Michigan. And in fact, 1,000 communities had lead levels that were 4 times higher than what were exhibited in Flint. So that we don't have just a Flint problem, we have an infrastructure problem around water in the United States, which does not get spoken of. One of the reasons for this is that we have really outdated drinking water standards. And so not until 1974 did the Safe Drinking Water Act become in effect. And that's basically not been updated in 50 years. So if you think about, car safety standards, for example, or car seats in cars, imagine that those didn't get updated over a period of 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's really unconscionable. And then when you look at that, and I'm gonna share some data in a little bit about the proliferation of chemical compounds. In fact, in the interest of time, I'm just gonna do it now. In 1984, there were about 67,000 chemicals in use in the United States, okay? Early 80s, about 67,000 chemicals. In the last few years, that number has increased to around 87,000 chemicals in the United States. Guess how many of those are covered by the Safe Drinking Water Act? Take a guess.
Zero.
Well, okay, it's higher than zero. This is not gonna be a shocker, it's 97. So there are 86,903 chemicals that are used in the United States that are not regulated and not defined by the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so we have a situation now where we can no longer trust the tap. Now, this might be a little bit polarizing for some people in this room because a lot of people are like, well, hey, we have a bottled water problem that's created a proliferation of single-use plastics. We're now literally drinking our bottled water, even if you're not drinking bottled water. So there's a study done by SUNY that sampled several different top bottled water brands and found about, on average, over 90% of those bottles of water had around 300 microplastics per liter of water. This is one of the reasons why you're drinking and eating a credit card's worth of plastic every single month. And that's one of the reasons why it's being found in about 90% of umbilical tissue. Most recently, according to New England Journal of Medicine, 100% of placentas. In fact, I just saw a documentary screening that's getting released shortly where OBGYN is doing a cross-sectional of a placenta, and he's literally pulling out visual pieces, almost like macroplastics, chunks of plastic from the placenta. And part of the reason for this is because of the proliferation of single-use plastics and the insanity of single-use bottled water. And so a lot of us in the environmental community have been, really evangelizing, well, don't do that, drink from the tap, drink from the tap. And the problem is that we're in a situation today where even though single-use plastic water bottles are really the new environmental cigarette. This is the new cigarette. I wish I had enough time where I could talk about all the parallels of big tobacco and big bottled water and big beverage companies today. There are many, everything from culture to regulation to legislation to lobbying to economic incentives. I don't have time to cover that today, but we're in a position today where we exist as a company because we believe it is a fundamental human right that everybody deserves access to clean drinking water that they can trust. And unfortunately today, that does not exist. And so in our interest of stopping this insane proliferation use of single-use plastic water bottles, we've tried to get people back to the tap. And about 80%, depends on the data source. You can pick the most favorable data source says about 65% of consumers don't trust or don't like tap water. The other extreme of that is around 80, 82, 84% of consumers don't trust tap water. The reality is the majority of people don't like it, don't trust it. Now it's known to be for very good reason. The lead data, PFAS is another example, glyphosate, commonly known as and marketed as Roundup. So what we have to do is we have to restore the tap water system in the United States, and I'm gonna share 4 quick points on how to do that. Number 1, plan and invest in infrastructure. It's gonna take $1 trillion in around 50 years to rebuild the infrastructure and to invest in the local municipal water development plants to get water up to snuff where it's safe and clean and also equalized for people. If we do not start today, there will be no tomorrow. So we need to start at some point. It's not an immediate solution, but that's one of them. The second is we've got to update the standards in the legislation. I'm gonna give you one example. If you look at glyphosate, for example, you know what? I'll probably use PFAS as well. EPA standards for PFAS are around 800 parts, glyphosate. I'm gonna use glyphosate. There are no standards in PFAS in Safe Drinking Water Act and in drinking water consumption. So glyphosate is regulated at around 800 parts per billion. EWG, Environmental Working Group, says that the only safe amount is around 5 parts per billion. And so if you look at the delta of that, who are you gonna trust, the EPA or EWG? I'm gonna put my money on EWG because there are all sorts of other dynamics and influences in the legislative process that affects EPA. We should tax responsible parties. This is the second to last one. If we taxed bottled water and big beverage, just bottled water, let's just look at that. If we tax bottled water at the same rate that we taxed cigarette companies to help clean up the mess as well as educate, that would generate $10 billion a year. That could be rebuilt into infrastructure as well as education. And then the final thing is, and this is the focus of our company today, and you see the product that's out front, is to really redefine the last 6 feet of water line throughout the United States. And that's take available tap water today, put a FloWater refill station, in our case, a refill station, where we radically change that water, where we eliminate all of the toxins, pharmaceuticals, herbicides, pesticides, redefine that with electrolytes, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and create something that consumers want to do. If we ask them to do it because they have to do it, or because it's just good for the environment, or because they're poisoning the oceans, lakes, rivers, and landfills, and it's a solution that they do not absorb or they do not like, they are not going to do it. And so what we need to do is we need to bring people back to the tap. and in the process of that, drive the change and advocate the change. Thanks for the great opportunity to be here and spend time with all of you today.